Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming along to this debate, which is of very high importance. And it may sound a bit strange then to start with asking us all to consider a question that runs something like, what is all the fuss about? And I raise this because if one takes a certain perspective about the production of art around the world, there's a handy recent production by a French anthropologist called Philippe Descola, who has identified 4 principal ways in which humans make art. There is the totemic, there is the animistic, there is the naturalistic, and there is, wait for it, it's a mouthful, the analogistic. It sounds easier in French, but analogism. No, it's not easier. It's still a mouthful, but it's making analogies. And in his conspectus of the forms of the visible around the world, actually Greek art doesn't get more than a few pages. The Parthenon is barely mentioned. But it's analogical. It is creating a mimetic correspondence to something, and as such, it forms, as it were, just one of these quartets of the human production of art. Now, Ernst Gombrich, in his Story of Art, I'm sure some of you have this on your shelves, he popularized this concept of the Greek Revolution, which was his celebration of the marvelous effect of this analog art, to the point of, illusionism was what these Greeks achieved. And it used to be, and I think in some quarters, including my own personal quarter, the belief that as far as analog art goes, it doesn't get any better than the Parthenon sculptures. Or if you prefer to go to something in bronze of about the same period, do you know the bronzes from Riace? They're called the Riace bronzes, unimaginatively, because we're not sure exactly who they represent. But a bronze sculptor today will say, it can't be done today. And I suspect many sculptors today would admit that the quality of the marbles from the Parthenon technically cannot be equal. Now, you may be thinking, there aren't many sculptors today who would want to carve in this way, and I think you'd be right. I remember a student of Henry Moore's telling me that Henry Moore explicitly told his students, don't go to the British Museum, please. Not while you're learning how to do sculpture. Yeah, start with something else. Then you come to this question of what are they analogues? And it's not very easy to answer. I can tell you what the subjects, broadly speaking, are of the pediments and the metopes and the frieze, or rather I can introduce you, if we had another couple of hours with me doing a monologue, to the many controversies that there are about the interpretation of these pieces. Even in the 18th century, Goethe, without actually having seen the Parthenon sculptures, was already saying they've created a horse there which looks like no other horse, but it looks like all horses, amazingly. So it's quite difficult to put your finger on what these are analogues of, because they are an attempt to represent the supernatural. And go to the British Museum and you will see the sort of labels of what, broadly speaking, are the themes of these sculptures. But with the frieze, our inadequacy, I think, is proven by a label that says of the frieze that it displays some kind of representation of a religious festival, the great Panathenaic festival, in precise. And it gives visitors the entirely erroneous idea that young men at religious festivals walked around without their clothes on, which is as bizarre in ancient Greece as it would be today. So what am I saying? I'm saying actually that these sculptures are, some people would use the word gobsmacked. I think I prefer ineffable. They transcend utterance. And I think one thing that both sides will agree on here is that as analog art, they are something very special. But we don't really comprehend what they're all about. Which leaves us in this sort of crux of trying to establish what they might always have been about once upon a time. And I still find this difficult to believe, my students find this difficult to believe, but there is really only one text in antiquity that tells us anything about the making of the Parthenon and its sculptures, its decoration. You know, someone as verbose as Herodotus and as meticulous as Herodotus was there in Athens when it was being put up. Search his histories, there's not a word about the Parthenon. And it's extraordinary just of the collective silence that there is from antiquity about it, except for one of, to my mind, one of the most readable of all ancient authors, who is a fellow called Plutarch. And he has left us a whole series of lives which were very precious to Shakespeare for his history plays. And if you look at his life of Pericles, you will find there is an account of the building of the Parthenon, and it sort of gives you a choice of narratives as to which you want to go to, because he's telling you that there was, very close to Pericles, a master sculptor called Phidias, who enjoyed not just a good rapport with Pericles, but one in which, I mean, there was a lot of gossip about how the two of them functioned, including some fairly, what's the word? Sleazy, I suppose. Stories about how Phidias would pimp for Pericles. Somewhere there's a story, an anecdote about a chap who is raising prize peacocks in order to bribe women and so on. There's a story about the embezzlement of funds that were provided for the Parthenon. But there's also this picture that Plutarch paints of a unparalleled collective effort by the citizens of Athens, politically motivated by Pericles. He makes it very clear that Pericles was spreading wealth from the Athenian Empire to all levels of society, a trickle-down effect that involved, you know, Plutarch even mentions there's so much work going on to build this thing in record time that people's shoes all wore out and the cobblers were just turning out shoes as fast as they could. So everyone in Athens benefited from this. And this is testified by the inscriptions around from the excavations on the Acropolis, which don't mention Phidias at all, but mention numerous committees and numerous collective efforts to get the thing done in this amazing time. Now, arguably, there is, I've heard people, including the current curator at the British Museum, Tom Harrison, put this forward, there is something of a dialogue between the Parthenon frieze and what was being constructed at the capital of the Persian Empire, the frieze at Persepolis. And bear in mind that the building of the Parthenon was essentially to commemorate the reclaiming by the Athenians of their sacred space after the trauma of war with Persia and the desecration of that space by Persian occupiers of the Acropolis who, to put it crudely, trashed it. So the Parthenon was a rebuilding of Athens, and Plutarch makes it very clear everyone was involved, and it wasn't really about sort of setting up a dialogue with Persepolis. That would have been a very remote, I think, comparison or an opposition to wouldn't have struck people in antiquity. But basically, it was saying, you're not in Athens, you're not in Sparta, you're not in Corinth, or you're not in Sparta. You are in Athens, and this embellishment of this temple, which it's still a curiosity to archaeologists as to what went on in this temple, because it doesn't seem to have had any immediate religious function. It's almost like it's gratuitously a lot of effort. But it was there, really, as this cohesive project that involved the whole city. And that's really as much as we can get from the testimonies of antiquity as to what it's all about. Now you'll notice that behind me I have brought an old friend along. Just want to correct one thing that Jonathan has said, which is that there were no protests about what was happening when the marbles were taken down. In fact, there were protests about the removal of this particular horse, one of the 4 horses of the goddess of the moon. The goddess, the sun is coming up on one side of the east pediment, and on the right-hand side of the east pediment, the moon, with her horses completely exhausted, is going down. And in fact, it was an English observer, E.D. Clark, who recorded and wrote a letter of protest that what had been created by Phidias for this space had been ripped away from it. And actually, if you look closely at the horse's head, you can see that someone, Phidias or someone, misjudged, and they had to lop away some of the mane. And the reason that she'd stayed so successfully on the ledge of the cornice was because she'd been wedged very firmly in. But it seems to me that this sentiment that was recorded by an English observer, who chimes actually with another protest by Lord Byron about what was happening, and who knows what the local Greek and Turkish reactions were. But what Clark noted was the message that I think I'm going to leave as my opening sentiment here, that what we're talking about is what the Greeks would call a nostos. It is a homecoming for pieces that belong to a project that really only makes sense on the Athenian Acropolis.